Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the ancient world, not as dusty ruins in a museum, but alive, vibrant, pulsing with the footsteps of kings and queens, armies and slaves, dreamers and schemers. Long before our modern cities and glass towers, there were kingdoms of stone and bronze, of blood and gold. These were the civilizations that first taught humankind how to rule, how to worship, how to build, how to betray, and how to love. The ancient world was a stage, and upon it, some of the greatest dramas of history unfolded. The stage lights were the blazing desert sun, or the flickering glow of oil lamps. The actors were emperors and peasants alike. And the themes? Power, ambition, betrayal, and love. Always love. Let us begin in the valley of the Nile, the river that never dies. The Nile's waters moved steadily, rising and falling in their yearly floods, nourishing fields of barley and wheat. Around it, Egypt rose like a miracle from the sand. Here stood colossal temples carved from mountains. Here kings declared themselves gods. And here, love and betrayal were written in hieroglyphs on the walls of eternity. The pharaohs were more than rulers. They were divine beings on earth. Their crowns glittered with lapis lazuli and gold. Their words were law. And their deaths gave birth to monuments that still defy time. The pyramids. Imagine the sweat of thousands of laborers, pulling limestone blocks across the desert. Each block a prayer, each pyramid a promise that their king would live forever. But behind the grandeur was struggle. Court intrigues brewed in the shadow of temples. Priests competed with pharaohs for power. Brothers turned against brothers, wives plotted against husbands. And at the center of it all was a single truth, that in the game of kings, betrayal was as eternal as the Nile itself. Among the most famous tales of love and ambition was that of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Though technically much later than the builders of pyramids, she embodied the ancient Egyptian spirit of survival. Cleopatra was a queen, a strategist, and above all, a woman who understood the dangerous dance of love and power. With her came the story of alliances sealed not by ink, but by kisses. First with Julius Caesar, and then with Mark Antony. Her beauty and wit bent the wills of Rome's most powerful men, but Rome was ruthless. When Augustus turned against her, Cleopatra chose death by asp, rather than live without her crown. In her story, we see how love, when entangled with power, becomes both salvation and destruction. Now shift your gaze eastward to the Fertile Crescent, where two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, gave life to the world's first great cities. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here stood Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, places where writing was first carved into clay, where kings raised ziggurats toward the heavens, and where armies thundered across plains in search of glory. Among these cities, Babylon shone brightest. Its most famous king, Hammurabi, etched laws into stone. His code was harsh but revolutionary. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. For the first time, justice was not just the whim of a ruler, but written for all to see. Yet even in Babylon, betrayal whispered in dark halls. Take the tale of King Nebuchadnezzar II. He built the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, supposedly for his queen, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Imagine terraced gardens, lush with palm trees and vines, watered by ingenious systems of pulleys and wheels, a symbol of love immortalized in stone. And yet his empire crumbled under the weight of its ambition. Babylon, like every empire before and after, learned that love can inspire greatness. But betrayal, whether from within or from rival kings, brings ruin. And then came the Assyrians, the most feared warriors of the ancient world. Their kings carved walls with images of conquests, cities burning, prisoners impaled, enemies flayed alive. Terror was their language of rule. But even they fell. Why? Because empires that rule by fear alone eventually collapse, betrayed not by enemies at the gates, but by the hatred within their own subjects' hearts. From the ashes of Mesopotamia rose another power, Persia. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia became the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Unlike the Assyrians, Cyrus ruled not by cruelty but by tolerance. He allowed conquered peoples to keep their religions and customs. His empire was built not just on conquest but on respect. But Persia too had its dramas of betrayal and love. Darius the Great and his son Xerxes waged wars against Greece, and behind their armies stood queens and advisors whispering strategies. Herodotus tells us of plots within the Persian court, ambitious brothers, jealous nobles, and even assassinations carried out under the cover of night. Love also played its role. The story of Xerxes and his queen Amestris is one of both devotion and cruelty. Amestris was fiercely loyal to her husband, but infamous for her brutal revenge against rivals. Here again in the palace halls of Persepolis, love and betrayal walked hand in hand, shaping the destiny of millions. And now to Greece, the land of philosophers and poets, of warriors and gods. Here, history and myth intertwine so closely that sometimes it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. There was the Trojan War, sparked, they say, by love, when Paris of Troy stole Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, from her Greek husband. Was it truly love, or was it lust? Or perhaps politics cloaked in romance? Whatever the truth, the result was a decade of bloodshed. Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, names that still echo like thunder. A war for a woman became a legend for all time. The sun rises again upon the ancient world, and we move from the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt toward lands that would shape the destiny of humankind in new and dramatic ways. The torch of civilization did not stay still. It passed like a flame from one empire to another, each burning bright before fading into the shadows of history. Take, for example, Alexander of Macedon, whom we know as Alexander the Great, born in 356 BCE, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle himself. Alexander grew up dreaming not of small kingdoms, but of world conquest. At only 20 years old, after his father Philip II's assassination, he inherited the throne of Macedon. Most men would have struggled to hold such power. Alexander expanded it beyond imagination. He marched east through Persia, crushing the once mighty empire of Darius III. The battles of Issus and Gaugamela were not merely victories. They were demolitions of a centuries-old empire. His soldiers followed him through deserts and mountains, across the mighty Indus River, into lands they had never imagined. Alexander was a conqueror, but also a visionary. He founded cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, planting seeds of culture and learning that would survive long after his empire collapsed. And yet, in his triumph lay tragedy. At only 32 years old, Alexander died in Babylon, possibly poisoned, possibly struck by fever. His empire fractured within days, carved up by his generals in a storm of betrayal and ambition. His dream of uniting the world under one crown died with him, leaving only stories that would inspire kings and conquerors for millennia. Here, betrayal wasn't simply the act of daggers in the dark. Betrayal was the breaking of his dream by those closest to him, men who once swore loyalty but chose greed instead. As Greece fell into internal wars and divided kingdoms, a new power stirred in the west. On the banks of the Tiber River, a small city would rise to dominate the world: Rome. Rome's story is one of resilience. According to legend, it began with Romulus and Remus, twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf. From myth grew a republic, a system where senators and citizens debated laws, and armies marched under banners of discipline and steel. But Rome's history, too, is written in betrayal and blood. Julius Caesar, one of the most brilliant generals in history, expanded Rome's territories through the conquest of Gaul, defeating enemies against overwhelming odds. His ambition, however, grew larger than the Republic could contain. When he marched on Rome, crossing the Rubicon River, he sealed the fate of the Republic. The die is cast, he said, and it truly was. Caesar declared himself dictator for life. The senators, fearing the death of the Republic, conspired against him. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar walked into the Senate, only to be stabbed 23 times by men he once called friends. Among them was Brutus, whom he loved like a son. His last words, whispered through pain, carried the ultimate sense of betrayal. "Et tu, Brute." The Republic died with Caesar. What rose in its place was an empire. Rome crowned its first emperor, Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, who brought stability after years of civil war. But stability rarely lasted in Rome. The empire stretched across continents, from Britain to the deserts of Arabia, from Spain to the Nile. With such vastness came unimaginable wealth, and with wealth came corruption. Consider Emperor Nero, remembered as a tyrant. He ruled with extravagance, burning through Rome's treasury on grand performances and luxuries. When a great fire consumed the city, many believed he had ordered it himself. He blamed the Christians, beginning one of the first great persecutions. His cruelty became legendary, until finally even Rome could no longer bear him. And yet Rome also produced emperors of brilliance. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, wrote meditations on duty, wisdom, and mortality, even as he led campaigns against barbarian invasions. His reign represented Rome at its height of both power and intellect. But no matter the emperor, tyrant, or sage, the empire carried within itself the seeds of decline. Betrayal was constant. Generals turning against emperors, senators conspiring, assassinations carried out in the dark halls of palaces. It would be unfair to tell the story of the ancient world without speaking of love, the force that both built and destroyed empires. We already spoke of Cleopatra in part 1, the Egyptian queen whose beauty and intellect captured both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but hers was not the only tale. Kings often married for politics, binding nations together, yet behind those alliances often lay true love, or forbidden love. Consider Paris and Helen of Troy, whose affair sparked the Trojan War, conflict that destroyed a city and filled Homer's epics with timeless passion and tragedy. Or look again at Rome, where Antony, one of Caesar's loyal generals, abandoned his duty to Rome because of his love for Cleopatra. Their story was not merely romance, it was the clash of two worlds, ending in their tragic suicides as Octavian, later Augustus, seized power. Love in the ancient world was as dangerous as the sword. Every empire, no matter how mighty, carries within it the seeds of its fall. Babylon crumbled under the weight of invaders. Egypt lost its independence to Rome. Greece divided itself until Rome conquered it, and Rome itself, despite centuries of dominance, fell to corruption, division, and the relentless pressure of barbarian tribes. But in these falls lay the eternal themes of human history: ambition, betrayal, loyalty, love, and tragedy. What do these stories of kings and empires mean for us today? They remind us that power is fragile and love is dangerous. They show us that betrayal often comes not from enemies, but from friends, brothers, and loves. They teach us that even the mightiest empires, glittering in wealth and glory, will eventually collapse into ruins, leaving behind only broken statues, fading manuscripts, and echoes in the memory of mankind. The ancient world is gone, but its stories live on, not just in dusty history books, but in our culture, our films, our dreams, and our fears. When you hear the name Alexander or Caesar or Cleopatra, you are not just hearing names, you are hearing the heartbeat of humanity itself. So ends the journey. From the sands of Mesopotamia and the tombs of Egypt, through the marble temples of Greece and the blood-stained Senate of Rome, these were the greatest stories of the ancient world, stories of kings who believed themselves gods, empires that thought they would last forever, betrayals that shattered worlds, and loves that burned brighter than the stars. And perhaps the greatest truth of all is this: though the empires have fallen, though the kings are dust, the stories remain. And as long as we tell them, they are immortal.